It started with a toast. The kind that's supposed to be warm, maybe a little sentimental, something to close out the evening with a smile. We'd just finished dinner, my roast chicken, the one he always told me reminded him of his mother's. Everyone was full, mellow from wine, half listening as he stood with his glass raised, our dining room dim and golden from the old chandelier we never replaced. He smiled. That quiet, practiced smile of his. I'd seen it charm clients, soothe waiters, disarm my friends. But that night, it felt aimed. He thanked everyone for coming, said it meant a lot to have family together, said how much he appreciated the journey, that was the word he used, the journey we had all been on. And then he said it. He said he was proud to have become a father again. His eyes swept the table, but didn't land on me. Not until the pause. Not until he added, almost gently, as though explaining something obvious to a child, that this time, the child had come naturally. Not everyone gets that gift, he said, and then finally looked at me. Not when the womb stays empty. I didn't say a word. Just nodded once and set my glass down. Later, people would say they hadn't understood what he meant. But I had. I understood every word. I didn't leave the table right away. That would have looked like surrender. I helped clear the plates, stacked the dessert forks, smiled when his sister complimented the custard. I even walked Mrs. Kinley to her car, the neighbor from across the street who always brought wine we didn't drink. I said goodbye to every guest with the same quiet tone I'd used for decades. The hostess voice. The voice of a woman who knows how to keep her hands steady. It wasn't until the front door clicked shut that I let the silence stretch. I didn't look at him, not when he leaned against the doorway sipping his brandy, not when he asked if I was upset. That was the word he used. Upset. As if what he'd done was spill wine on a tablecloth, not humiliate me in front of the people who had filled our lives for the last 30 years. I walked past him and went to the bedroom. Not a word. Not even a glance. I locked the door behind me, something I hadn't done in years. And for the first time in a long time, I slept without the ache of wanting him near. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table with a blank notepad in front of me and wrote everything I could remember, not just about that night, but about all the small things that had come before it. The sudden absences. The changed passwords. The appointments he said were rescheduled but never seemed to happen again. The trips I wasn't invited to. The way his voice had begun to lose its softness whenever I spoke. It wasn't just about the toast. It never is. It was about a pattern. I had met him in my late 20s, when I still thought love meant compromise. He was charming then. Smart. Measured. I liked his restraint, the way he listened more than he talked, how he took his coffee black and his opinions seriously. We were both cautious, both a little bruised from younger years. I thought that meant we were equals. We married 2 years after we met. I kept my name. He didn't mind. We bought a house together, small at first, then this one when my design work started to take off. He liked telling people I was successful, though I don't think he ever fully believed it. His job had prestige, real estate development, long lunches, late-night calls. Mine had creativity, but not gravity. That's what he used to call it. Not a gravity career. I brought in more money than he did for almost 10 years. He never said anything, but things shifted. Quietly. I paid the mortgage. I covered his sister's medical bills when she needed surgery and couldn't work. I put my mother in a good facility when her dementia turned. He helped, in his way. He brought flowers. He made the phone calls I couldn't. But he never asked how much any of it cost me, not just the money, but the part of myself I gave up each time I said yes without question. We tried for children. 4 years. The tests were inconclusive. Unexplained infertility, they called it. He never blamed me, not openly. But when his mother asked questions, he always said, "We're working on it," like it was a problem I hadn't solved yet. I took the hormones. I went through the procedures. He never missed a round of golf. When I finally stopped trying, stopped tracking my cycle like a map of failure, he didn't say anything. He just started coming home later. I used to tell myself that was life. That all long marriages became quieter. That maybe love was a thing you settle into like an old coat, worn, reliable, a little frayed but familiar. I told myself that because the alternative was too painful. That maybe he had outgrown me. That maybe he'd never really been with me at all. The woman he mentioned in the toast, he didn't say her name. But I knew. I'd seen her. She came to the house once, last year. Said she was dropping off documents from his office. She was younger. Maybe 30. Pretty, in the way young women often are, careless, unaware. She smiled at me with the same kind of pity I used to offer older women before I realized what a curse that smile can be. I watched her leave from the upstairs window. The way she lingered by his car, the way he looked at her, not just fondly, but possessively. Like something new. Something better. I didn't confront him then. I'd learned not to make things worse by asking questions I already knew the answers to. Instead, I started making copies. Of documents. Emails. Bank records. The shared account we hadn't touched in years, now suddenly active again. The hotel charges. The out-of-town restaurants. I wasn't looking for proof. I already had that. I was building a timeline. Preparing. By the time of the toast, I'd known about the child for 6 weeks. The way he phrased it, a gift, a surprise, a second chance, I could see the story he was telling. Not just to them, but to himself. That this wasn't betrayal. It was fate. That I had been the detour. The pause in his real life. I looked at him across the table that night and saw it clearly for the first time, not the man I'd married, but the man he had chosen to become. And I knew then, I wasn't going to fight for him. I wasn't going to beg to stay. I was going to leave him with nothing I had built. The next morning, he tried to pretend nothing had happened. He came into the kitchen whistling, something upbeat and rehearsed, like a man who needed noise to fill the silence. I was already at the table, coffee made, newspaper folded, pen in hand. I didn't look up. He cleared his throat. "So, last night." I waited. He tried a smile. "Didn't mean to blindside you. I thought maybe, well, you'd already suspected." "I didn't think." "You didn't think," I said, still not meeting his eyes. His mouth opened like he might say more. Then he closed it. He went to the fridge, poured himself orange juice. Sat down across from me. And for a moment, we were quiet, not the comfortable quiet of two people who know each other well, but the stiff, unsettled hush of strangers in the same room. "I didn't do anything wrong," he said finally. We were distant. For years. I turned the page of the paper. "She was going through something," he said. "She needed help. I didn't plan it." "No," I said softly. "You just didn't stop it." He flinched. I could see it, a twitch at the corner of his mouth, the way his hand tightened around the glass. I wondered if he'd expected me to scream. Cry. Throw something. He didn't understand that I had already done all of that, privately, quietly, in the weeks leading up to this. "I don't want this to get ugly," he said. "It doesn't have to be ugly." That was when I finally looked at him. "It's already ugly," I said. "You just prefer your ugliness behind closed doors." That was the end of that conversation. The next 2 days passed in stiff choreography. He left early. Came home late. slept in the guest room. I made no mention of anything, just moved through the house like a tenant finishing out the lease. But in my studio upstairs, I worked. Not on a client project, I'd put those on hold, but on something more personal. I took out the file folders I had started building months ago and began sorting them by type: financials, legal documents, communications. I opened a spreadsheet and began listing each asset I had personally contributed to, every renovation I had paid for, every mortgage payment covered by my income, every transfer from my accounts into our joint holdings. I tallied receipts. I pulled records. I printed emails. On the third morning, I walked into a downtown law office I'd researched weeks earlier and met with the senior partner, a woman named Valerie Cormier. Sharp suit, no nonsense. She took one look at the stack I handed her and raised her eyebrows. "You've been thorough." "I'm a designer," I said. "Details matter." Valerie spent 2 hours reviewing my records, asking precise questions. By the end, she leaned back and said, "You have a strong case. You've documented everything. The prenup may protect certain assets, but anything you've significantly contributed to, especially improvements made with your funds, can be negotiated." "I don't want to negotiate," I said. "I want what's mine." Valerie smiled, small and approving. "Then that's what we'll get." The papers were drawn up within a week. Petition for divorce, request for full ownership of the home, division of jointly held accounts. I'd already separated my personal funds. He hadn't noticed, or perhaps he had and didn't yet understand the significance. I served him the papers on a Friday. He came home late, loosened his tie like he still lived in the rhythm of our old life, and found them waiting on the kitchen table with a single sentence in my handwriting on top. "I'm not staying where I'm unwelcome." He didn't say anything that night. I heard him pacing in the hallway. Heard the sharp click of his phone being placed on the nightstand. The door never opened. The next morning, I found him sitting in the living room, bleary-eyed and sour. "You didn't even want to talk about it?" he asked. "No," I said, setting my coffee cup down. "I've been talking to myself about it for years. I'm finished." "I've made a mistake," he said. "Yes," I agreed. But it wasn't the affair. It was thinking I wouldn't notice. That I wouldn't fight. He looked smaller somehow, like a man who'd built his identity on being untouchable and was now seeing the cracks. I didn't feel sorry for him. I didn't feel anything. "You're going to ruin everything," he said. "No," I said calmly. "I'm going to save myself. What you do is up to you." That afternoon, I packed what I needed, only the essentials, and moved into a short-term apartment Valerie had found for me. It was small but full of light, with white walls and tall windows that overlooked a quiet street. The kind of place I might have lived in if I'd made different choices, married someone else, or not at all. That night, I slept better than I had in months. He tried calling the first week I was gone. Twice. Once late in the evening, once around noon on a Sunday, the time he knew I used to sit in the garden with coffee. I didn't answer. He didn't leave messages. Just the missed calls flashing on my screen like small attempts at control. By the second week, he switched tactics. He sent a text, "We need to talk." I didn't reply. Another one came the next day, "Let's be civil." Then nothing for 3 days. Then a final text, "You'll regret this." I read it while stirring a pot of soup in my little kitchen, the steam fogging the windows as rain tapped gently at the glass. I stared at the words, the arrogance of them, the certainty, and felt nothing but relief. Valerie moved quickly. By the end of the month, we had filed for temporary orders to prevent any assets from being moved or liquidated. She secured an injunction on the house and froze the shared investment accounts. When the notice was delivered, he finally responded, not with words, but with his lawyer. A man from one of the big firms downtown. Polished, expensive, arrogant in the way that assumes money equals moral high ground. They filed a countersuit the following week. Claimed I had abandoned the marital home, attempted to paint me as emotionally unstable, questioned the legitimacy of my financial contributions. Valerie was unimpressed. "We expected this," she said, her fingers tapping the thick folder of exhibits we'd compiled. "He's throwing darts in the dark. He doesn't know how much you've documented." He didn't. That was the point. He thought I'd walked away in anger, in heartbreak. He didn't realize I'd walked away prepared. In the months that followed, the legal process unfolded like a slow, inevitable storm. Depositions. Financial disclosures. Expert assessments. Every time they tried to claim something, we presented records. Receipts. Photos. Emails. I had an entire drawer labeled "Foundation," filled with the proof that everything I was asking for was built on my labor, my earnings, my sacrifices. He showed up at the first mediation session looking tired, older. His eyes were shadowed, his shirt wrinkled. But the smugness hadn't entirely left him. "This doesn't have to be a war," he said across the table. "It's not," I replied. "Wars require two sides. I'm just reclaiming what's mine." He didn't speak for the rest of the meeting. Outside the mediation office, I stood in the cold for a long time, letting the air numb my face. I thought about the years I'd spent believing that being quiet meant being dignified. That choosing calm over confrontation was strength. But sometimes, silence is just permission. That night, I made a decision. I reopened my old design portfolio, not the one I kept for clients, but the personal work. Sketches. Color studies. Room plans I'd made just for myself, imagining homes I'd never lived in. I spent hours at the drafting table, letting my hands remember what they'd once loved. By midnight, I had the beginnings of a new project, a design firm. Small. Specific. Just for women rebuilding their lives. I would offer consultations, space planning, emotional support through environment. I would build spaces that reminded them they deserved beauty, not because someone allowed it, but because they claimed it. I named it Second Light. Because sometimes, the first sunrise is a lie. When I told Valerie, she nodded. "Good," she said. "Make something from it." He tried one more time. I knew he would. The man I married was many things, strategic, cruel, brilliant at hiding behind good manners, but he wasn't used to losing. He showed up at the apartment without warning, just after the third mediation session, holding a bouquet of lilies. My favorite. Or they used to be. I didn't let him inside. I stepped out onto the landing in my coat, the door locked behind me. "You're really doing this," he said. "I already did." He looked tired. Not performatively, genuinely. His eyes held something close to panic, but not quite. Men like him don't panic. They regroup. "She's not what I thought," he said quietly. "The other one." "Neither were you," I said. He looked down, then back up, something sharper in his expression now. "You think you're better than this? Above this kind of mess?" "I know exactly what kind of mess this is," I said. "I lived inside it for 30 years. The flowers trembled slightly in his hand. "I didn't take them. I made mistakes," he said. "No," I replied. "You made choices. Mistakes are accidents. This was built." He stood there a moment longer, as if expecting something, forgiveness, maybe. Or weakness. But I had neither to offer. "Don't come back," I said. "Next time I call the police." He left the lilies on the steps. I let the wind take them overnight. In the morning, they were wilted and half-scattered, petals blown across the pavement like confetti from a party that never should have happened. That was the last time I saw him face to face. 3 weeks later, the court finalized the temporary order. I retained the house, the contents, and all assets traced to my income. The firm he worked for had begun internal audits, the result of a quiet tip, not from me, but someone else who had started asking questions about where certain funds had gone. I heard through Valerie that he was being repositioned, which meant demoted, without title, and put under review. And the woman? She'd filed for child support. He contested paternity. The irony was almost laughable. I never followed up on the outcome. Instead, I focused on second light. I rented a small space in a converted mill building, exposed brick, tall windows, just enough room for a drafting table, a desk, and 2 armchairs. My first client was a woman named Helen, early 60s, newly divorced after 40 years. Her husband had left her for someone younger. She said it as if reciting a cliché she couldn't quite believe applied to her. He said he wanted to feel alive again, she told me. Then let's build a space that makes you feel that way, I said. We chose bold colors, rich textures, lighting that warmed the room like afternoon sun. She cried when it was finished. So did I. I took on more clients. Word spread slowly, but it spread. Women came to me with apartments they'd rented after leaving marriages, or houses they'd inherited from mothers they never expected to outlive. They wanted spaces that felt like beginnings, not aftermaths. I gave them that. And in doing so, gave it to myself. In the quiet of my studio, surrounded by fabric swatches and paint samples, I felt something I hadn't in years: clarity. Not happiness. Not yet. But something better. Agency. The final hearing was scheduled for early spring. The kind of brittle March morning where the air still bites, but the sun pretends otherwise. I arrived alone. Valerie met me at the courthouse steps with a quiet nod, her briefcase in hand, crisp in a navy suit that reminded me, not for the first time, why I'd trusted her with everything. She didn't ask how I was feeling. She knew. He was already inside. So was his attorney, who offered a tight smile as we passed, the kind men use when they're trained to win but know they're losing. The judge was punctual. Female. Late 50s, I'd guess. She listened. She read every line of the documents, every footnote, every addendum. She asked questions with the precision of someone who had heard every kind of story and no longer allowed tone to sway judgment. It lasted an hour and 23 minutes. Not that I was counting. At the end, the judge's voice was clear and final. The house was mine. The accounts tied to my income, mine. My retirement fund, untouched. He retained only what he'd brought into the marriage, a dwindling portfolio, his name on a firm slowly distancing itself from his behavior, and an apartment he'd rented in haste once it became clear the house would not be his sanctuary. There were no gasps. No scenes. Just silence. The kind that feels like fresh air after being held underwater. Afterward, he tried to catch my eye as I packed my bag. I didn't look up. Not even once. Valerie touched my elbow on the way out. That's the cleanest victory I've seen in months, she said. I nodded, but my throat was tight. Victory felt too loud a word. Outside, the street was bright with sun but still cold. I stood at the curb and let the chill press into my skin. It felt honest. The next week, I moved back into the house. I expected it to feel haunted, not by ghosts, but by memory. The kitchen where we once danced on Saturday mornings. The hallway where we argued about nothing that turned into everything. The bedroom where silence grew between us like ivy. I thought I might need to exorcise every corner. But it surprised me. Once the locks were changed, and the curtains replaced, and his books boxed up and donated, the house softened. It felt like it had been waiting for me to claim it, like a room left untouched after company finally leaves. I painted the dining room first. The same space where he'd made his toast. I covered the wall in a pale green, soft, matte, calming. I replaced the table with something smaller, something mine. I threw out the heavy chairs. Too many memories. Too much weight. I added shelves in the living room. Real ones, not the floating slabs he always insisted looked modern. These were built-ins, deep and wide. I filled them with books I loved, not the ones we displayed for appearance. Bit by bit, the house became unrecognizable from what it had been. Clients came to see the changes, to ask about design ideas. I showed them swatches and light plans, and sometimes we drank tea and talked about more than paint. They told me about their losses, husbands, parents, jobs, selves. We spoke in quiet voices about reinvention. I told them, gently, that beauty doesn't erase pain, but it can hold it more kindly. One afternoon, I was standing on a ladder in the upstairs hallway, adjusting a light fixture, when the doorbell rang. I climbed down slowly, wiping my hands on a towel, and opened the door without checking. It was her. The woman from the office. She looked different. Older than I remembered. Or maybe just more ordinary now that the fantasy had broken. She held a child on her hip, a boy, maybe 2 years old, and her expression flickered between tired and something else. Fear, maybe. Is he here? She asked. I blinked. He doesn't live here. Her face fell. He told me he's still. She stopped herself. Shifted the child. I'm sorry. I didn't know where else to go. I stepped onto the porch, pulled the door mostly shut behind me. He's not part of this house anymore, I said. She nodded slowly. He stopped answering my calls. I thought. I can't help you, I said, not unkindly. She looked down. The child fussed a little, rubbing his eyes. He said you left. That you didn't want a family. That he tried. I almost laughed. Of course he did. She looked at me then. Really looked. Did he do this to you too? I thought about that. No, I said finally. He did something worse. He made me forget who I was. She closed her eyes for a moment. Then nodded again, slower this time. I'm sorry, she said. For everything. I watched her walk back to the car. The child's small hand clutched her collar. She drove away without looking back. I didn't feel vindicated. Just tired. But also, finally, free. That night, I made myself a small celebration dinner, lemon pasta, roasted vegetables, a glass of cold white wine. I sat in the kitchen, candles lit, jazz playing low on the radio. I didn't toast to anything. Just sat still. Ate slowly. Let the silence feel like presence rather than absence. The house was quiet, but not empty. I went upstairs to bed, the hallway now lit with soft sconces I had chosen myself, and lay in fresh sheets under a duvet I hadn't shared with anyone. Sleep came easy. And in the morning, for the first time in years, I didn't brace myself for anything. I simply got up. Spring warmed the windows slowly. By April, I had opened every one in the house just to feel the air move differently. I liked the breeze through the living room, the smell of lilacs drifting from the hedge out front. The neighborhood looked as it always had, trimmed lawns, Saturday rakes and coffee cups, the dog from 3 houses down always managing to escape and make his rounds. But I was different now. And the house, finally, felt like mine. Second Light was beginning to grow. The firm stayed small, by design. I took on 2 clients a month, no more. Women who came in carrying quiet griefs, often not sure if what they were feeling counted as loss. Widows. Divorcees. One woman who had finally retired from a job that had consumed her for 40 years and realized she didn't know how to live in silence. I met them all in that studio with the brick walls and soft lamplight. We drank tea. We made mood boards. We talked about light fixtures and the difference between solitude and loneliness. Every project was a kind of restoration. Not of what had been lost, but of what had been neglected. Helen, my first client, invited me over 6 months later for a housewarming. She'd remarried, surprisingly. A quiet man from her book club. Someone who liked to garden. I stood in the kitchen I'd helped design and saw my work in the blue tiles she'd chosen for courage, the reclaimed oak shelves for steadiness, the soft gold light above the sink for warmth. She hugged me and whispered, "It feels like me now." That was all I ever wanted my work to do. I thought about him less than I expected. Not with longing. Not even with rage. Just the way you remember a room you used to sit in every day and haven't walked through in years. A mental shape, not a presence. There were moments, small ones, where the old life tugged. Seeing couples in restaurants. Watching someone on the train rest their head on another's shoulder. But those weren't regrets. They were reminders. I missed the version of myself who still believed things would work out if I just loved hard enough. But that version had lived her story. She'd earned her rest. Sometimes I'd walk through the house at night, barefoot, lights low, glass of water in hand, and talk to that younger self like she was still somewhere in the walls. You did everything you could. You gave too much. It wasn't your fault. One afternoon, nearly a year to the day since the toast, I got a letter in the mail. Real mail. Handwritten address, familiar script. No return name, but I recognized the slope of the G in my sleep. I stood at the kitchen counter a long time before opening it. Inside, 1 page. No date. Just his handwriting. I've lost everything. I think you knew I would. I've spent the last year trying to explain things to people who don't care, and I keep thinking about how you always listened, even when I didn't deserve it. I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted to say I see it now. All of it. What I did to you. What I let rot. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect anything. But I wanted you to know that I know. That's all. No signature. Just the creased paper and my name at the top, plain as rain. I folded it once and placed it in the bottom drawer of my desk. Not out of sentiment. Just to remember that he could speak plainly when it no longer benefited him. I never responded. A few weeks later, I was invited to speak at a small conference for women in transitional life stages, a community group formed by a local therapist I'd worked with. They wanted a talk about space and healing. I spent days drafting it, and then, the night before, I threw it away. Instead, I stood in front of 20 women in a softly lit room and told the story, stripped of names, simplified to its bones, a long marriage, a betrayal, a house that became a mirror. And then I said something I hadn't planned to say. I used to think dignity meant silence. That if I didn't scream or fall apart, I was winning. But silence can be a kind of surrender, too. And some things are worth raising your voice for, even if no one claps when you're done. When I finished, they didn't clap right away. They sat there, some blinking, some holding tissues, all very still. And then one woman, maybe 70, silver braid down her back, whispered, "Thank you." That was enough. Afterward, one of the younger women, no older than 30, came up to me. "How did you start over?" she asked. I looked at her. Her eyes were hopeful and terrified. "I stopped asking if I deserved better," I said. "And started asking if I could survive without settling." She nodded slowly, as if storing that somewhere for later. That night, I walked home through the city. Light rain, streetlights catching on the pavement, the sound of heels echoing behind me. I felt tall. Not because anyone had lifted me, but because I had stopped shrinking. The last piece I changed in the house was the bedroom. I had saved it for last, not because it hurt the most, but because I needed to know I could face it with clarity. I stripped everything. The mattress. The curtains. Even the floor rug, a wedding gift I had once adored. I painted the walls a color I'd never dared before, deep plum, almost black in certain light. I hung new drapes, thick velvet ones that shut the world out when I wanted it gone. I bought a new bed. Not from a catalog. I commissioned a local craftsman. Oak. Strong. Built to last. Above the bed, I placed a single framed word in small gold script. Enough. Not as in, nothing more. But as in, I am. I remember lying down that first night in the new space, the air smelling faintly of paint and cedar, and thinking, not with doubt, but with certainty, this is the life I chose. Not the one I fell into. Not the one someone made for me. Mine. And I knew I'd never go back. It's been 2 years now. People ask if I miss being married. They ask with tilted heads, soft voices, the way you ask someone if they miss a limb. I usually smile and say, not really. But that's not the whole truth. What I miss is smaller, quieter, not marriage itself, but the illusion I lived inside. The sense of being chosen. The belief that I belonged somewhere. That someone saw me and said, yes, her, always her. I miss what I thought I had. But grief is not a demand. It doesn't require you to stay. The house is filled differently now. Not louder, not brighter, just better. More honest. I wake up to light through the plum-colored curtains and know exactly where I am, who I am. My days are simple. I see clients. I take long walks. I cook for myself with ceremony, not apology. I've started taking classes again, not for credit, just for curiosity. Ceramics. Poetry. Last month, I signed up for a course on local history. I go not to learn how to start over, but to remember I'm not finished. I keep one armchair in the corner of the living room, near the window. It's where I sit at the end of the day, reading or just listening to the house settle around me. Sometimes there's a cat in my lap, a rescue, gray with white paws, who showed up on the porch one evening and never left. I named her Ivy, not for the old symbol of clinging, but for the way she wound herself into my life with quiet insistence. There are photographs in the hallway again. Not of the life that ended, but of what came after. Women I've worked with, before and after shots of rooms transformed. A shelf of small gifts from clients, a quilt square, a letterpress print, a hand-carved bowl. A reminder that what I do has value, and not because it comes with a salary or a title, but because it helps someone else see themselves clearly. I got a letter from Helen last month. She and her husband had sold the house and bought a small cottage by the coast. We needed less, she wrote. But I kept the kitchen light you chose. It still makes the whole room feel like morning. Sometimes, I wonder where he ended up. Not in the way people look back with longing. More like you check the rearview mirror out of habit. Just to be sure what you left behind is still behind you. Valerie told me he left the firm. Something about pressure from the partners, ethics reviews. The younger woman, she'd moved back to her hometown. Her son would be starting school soon. I heard that part through a mutual acquaintance, someone who worked in the same building. I don't feel anger anymore. Not even bitterness. That part has rusted away. What's left is distance. And a quiet gratitude that I'm no longer responsible for holding together something that never truly held me. Last week, I got a call from a woman named Clara. She said she'd found my name through someone I'd helped, didn't say who. Her voice shook when she spoke. I don't even know what I need, she said. Just. I don't want to keep living like this. I knew that voice. I met her at a coffee shop the next morning. She wore her fear the way some women wear perfume, as if layering it over everything might mask the truth. I didn't push. We talked about nothing at first. Weather. Pastries. Then she looked down at her hands and whispered, "He makes me feel small." I nodded. She blinked at me, and then asked, "How did you know it was time?" And I told her. When the fear of staying finally outweighed the fear of leaving. She started crying, right there in the cafe, and I reached across the table and held her hand until the shaking stopped. I'm working with her now. Quietly. Carefully. She hasn't moved out yet. But she's planning. You can always tell when the shift begins, it's not in the voice, but in the eyes. The way they start to look at doors instead of walls. Not every woman I meet chooses to leave. Not every woman can. But all of them learn something, that love is not the same as obligation. That silence does not equal peace. That you can grieve what hurt you, and still let it go. On Sundays, I still make roast chicken. Not because anyone expects it, but because I like the smell of rosemary and lemon in the kitchen. I set the table with care. Cloth napkin. Proper glass. I light a candle. I eat slowly. I don't rush anymore. The yard has changed too. I ripped out the hedges last summer. They'd always made the front look stiff, formal, like the house was preparing for inspection. I planted wildflowers instead. Coneflowers. Black-eyed Susans. Some blue flax I wasn't sure would take, but did. The bees like it. So do I. Sometimes, neighbors stop to admire the garden. They ask how long I've lived here. I always say the same thing. Not long. But it's mine. There are days I still catch myself expecting to hear a key in the door, a voice calling from the hallway. Habit is like that. But it fades. Not quickly. Not neatly. But surely. I'm not lonely. That surprises some people. I've had invitations. Kind gestures. A dinner or two that felt like it might lead somewhere. But I'm not looking to replace anything. Not yet. Maybe not ever. What I want is simpler now. Warm light in the kitchen. A bed that feels like safety. A life that doesn't ask me to prove my worth daily. The kind of life that says, "You've done enough. You are enough." Sometimes, in the morning, I sit with my coffee in the back garden, still wearing my robe, hair uncombed, ivy curled at my feet. And I think of all the versions of myself that got me here. The girl who thought marriage was protection. The wife who measured her value by how much she gave. The woman who stood quietly while someone else took center stage. And then I think of the woman I am now. And I thank her. Not with applause. Not with fanfare. Just with a full breath. A soft smile. And the quiet promise that she will never again have to ask permission to be whole.